Well, thank you very much, Prashant, for that. I have to say thank you too for inviting me to give this lecture. I look on Leicester as my second academic home. I have been coming over here for just a few years. And I was thinking actually when I was coming over today that the first time I came to give a paper and lecture in Leicester, I had been invited by Jim Dawes to give a lecture in his Victorian cities seminar that he held in 1969, which is a long time, a lifetime. Anyway, to Geddes. When I was first invited to give this lecture, I was actually quite pleased. We've just had an argument with Prashant about whose idea it was I should talk about Indian reports. And actually it was his, but I've responded because there seems to have been quite a lot of new work on Geddes recently, rather to my surprise. And the Indian and Palestinian reports have been a feature of this. And I've always sort of wandered around the Indian reports because Geddes didn't get to India until he was 60, I mean, and he left when he was 70. And he had a lifetime, and it took me almost 20 years to write the book about Geddes, getting him up to India. And then when I got to the reports, it was something different. But I always felt the whole time I was working on him that these were very important. In actual fact, I almost didn't do my work on Geddes because when I got the grant in 1970 to start, I discovered that there was no set of the reports available, and I thought this was the culmination of his work. So I actually wrote to the Funding Council and said, I'm sending my grant back. I can't do this work because how can I with the major work of this man isn't available? And they said, well, here's a lot more money. Will you please go and find them? And if you have to go all around India and Palestine, I mean Israel, and south of France and United States, that's what you have to do. So I couldn't refuse. So that's what I did. And the questions that the question I'd started when I was writing my book was, what do Geddes' planning reports tell us about his approach to urban planning? Well, now I would add another one, much more emphatically. What part did they play in Geddes' civic reconstruction activities, and what has been made of them since? Over the 10 years that I was looking for the reports, I managed to find all 18 volumes containing reports on 35 towns or parts of towns, or parts of cities. And I believe that to be the total actually published. The hunt for them had a huge advantage in that it often gave me direct experience of the places where Geddes worked and opportunities to meet people who'd even worked with Geddes. Also, the long gestation period I had completely changed my understanding of the importance of the reports. I realised there were numerous reasons why Geddes became engaged in Indian urban planning. The most obvious imperative was that he was able to earn a great deal of money by doing them. Throughout his life, he had to seek work because he only had a very part-time salary as a professor of botany at Dundee. And he wanted to fund his own Reconstruction work. He was responsible for projects such as the Outlook Tower in Edinburgh and all its many activities, and they were expensive. And the onset of war made possibility of commissions for his travelling exhibition, the Cities and Town Planning exhibition, far less likely in Britain, at least initially. India offered better prospects. But it was not just that drew him. He had long nurtured an interest in India and believed that his kind of work may bring a greater benefit to Indian people at this fast-changing time for the subcontinent. So now we're going to get the Indian reports. Actually, I just can't reach the machine. It's okay. I want to start with a complete list of the reports. It gives you an indication of the huge amount of material we are discussing and why most commentators and analysts opt for looking at one or two of them, or most a handful at a time. Each one is very specific to the time and place in which it was written. They represent an incredible volume of work, as Geddes undertook most of the task of collecting the information and writing the reports himself, only on occasions being given Indian assistance or other help. For Geddes, they were also a labour of love. His long-established interest in India was strengthened at the 1900 World Exposition in Paris, when he met Swami Vivekananda and the Lancashire woman Margaret Noble, the Swami's disciple, known as Sister Nivedita. During the course of the exposition, she helped Geddes with his special Paris summer school and became a close friend of the Geddes family. She fired his imagination about Indian life and culture and the immense task that lay ahead as this largely rural continent modernised and industrialised with the inevitable concomitant of rapid, massive urbanisation. When he finally got to India in 1914, Geddes was intoxicated with what he found in the Indian cities and small towns he visited. The liveliness of the streets, the colours and exuberance, the mixing of religious and spiritual concerns in daily life, especially the temples with their tanks and gardens where people came to bathe, to meet and to pray. He had arrived in South India, and it was the Dravidian temples that drew his greatest imagination. He wrote in 1919 of his appreciation of their varied magnificence. Even the commonest street is given order and beauty by the simply pillared Matapam, which its vista so often terminates, or is raised to dignity, even to sublimity, when it leads up to a mighty, many-storied Gopuram with its manifold exuberance of sculpture. The Indian reports were Geddes' attempt to bring back respect and enthusiasm for India's cities and cultural past, as much as they were promotions of a planning vision of the future. In the course of writing them, Geddes had given himself an education in town planning, and the stages of this learning curve I have attempted to indicate by giving different colours to the years, though this can only be done approximately. The first 4 volumes are blue. In the course of working on these, he moved from being a propagandist for city planning and development to becoming a planner himself. He cut his teeth on the first one, the 12 towns of the Madras Presidency, since he had originally gone there simply to set up his cities and town planning exhibition and to promote the idea of modern town planning to the Madras Municipal Council. Most of the Madras reports were extremely short, little more than accounts of brief visits he made in a morning or an afternoon. For one of them, Nellore, he wrote a report without even visiting it. He was not concerned about this, as the aim of the reports was to encourage municipal officials, especially the surveyors, to read maps in new ways. It was one of his great gifts to be able to do this himself. In Madras, he set up a short course to train surveyors in map reading techniques. And he rounded off his Madras reports with a propaganda statement of what he thought town planning should be. And I'm going to give you an extract, and I'm not going to read it out. I think you can read it out. Ooh, sorry. You for yourself. I'll give you a moment to do so, so you get a flavour of his prose. Have you read it? I'll get back. Oh, I don't think I can. That's right. The reports in the red section form the main bulk of his more detailed work, at its most intense in the winters of 1915 to 16 and 1916 to 17. Much of what Geddes wrote in his reports was directed towards municipal officials, especially the surveyors, the road engineers, and the public health officials. As he gained confidence, he launched into ever stronger criticisms of their work. The red-dated reports signify this change. In the first one, if you look, you can see that there are, the first four are all to municipal, first five are to municipal councils, and these were the people he was targeting. His most successful efforts was in Lucknow, where it was one of the few cities where he took his travelling exhibition. And his co-worker was the architect H.B. Lanchester, had a practice in Lucknow and came to support him and promote his work. And he also started an exhibition for demonstrating the changes he wanted to see in Lucknow. And he'd taken up with enthusiasm all the ideas that he had invented to meet the requirements of Indian cities. And this one that I'm going to tell you about is the one to do with sanitation and waterborne sewage. He took up the idea of using natural ways of getting rid of waste that were being explored by one or two other sanitarians in India, aware that waterborne sewage systems were a non-starter in India during the dry seasons. He wrote that India must follow the example of China and even ancient Rome. The Romans went so far as to create a special god of manure and manuring, and thus they incalculably aided their agriculturalists. The universal revival and renewal of historic and sacred traditions is now beginning. Will it be possible for these to go on without some cooperative and fertile contact between their historic faculties of ancient learning and their modern faculty of medicine, with its schools of bacteriology and public health? The associations of cleanliness and godliness will again be clearly formulated. One of his friends, the human geographer H.J. Fleur, wrote to him on reading this, "My dear Geddes, your Lucknow report is a source of much joy to me. Fancy getting such a fine exposition of civic philosophy with religious considerations as well into the section on latrines." The municipal authority was interested in his ideas and supportive, and he did 2 reports for them and finished off with a third one, not on town planning, but how to set up a zoological garden. as a public benefit and introduction for citizens to understand the natural sciences. By the time he got to Lahore, though, he was getting ever more critical of how municipal officials, British or Indian, the latter usually trained in Western methods, were treating the three current key problems of Indian cities: public health, especially malaria and plagues, new roads for relieving traffic congestion, and the provision of low-cost housing. Geddes had answers for all three, which he insisted were not only beneficial but cheaper, and all relied on the understanding of the natural sciences, but importantly, backed up by a fresh appreciation of Indian traditions and culture. He suggested that the filling up of temple tanks to eliminate the malarial mosquito was false economy. The tanks could be cleaned, stocked with fish, and supplemented with ducks, and were a crucial resource for encouraging people to be clean, as they were used for personal as well as ritual bathing. Plagues could be prevented by isolating granaries and raising them off the ground on stilts, keeping small armies of cats to kill the rats, and by encouraging cleanliness during the great festivals of Diwali, or Pongal, as it is called in the south. As for roads, this was his pet subject, since British civil engineers usually cut major thoroughfares through slum districts, as they had done for decades in Western cities, bringing railways to city centres, in the hope of easing traffic and getting rid of slums in one process. Geddes' answer was to take the town map and find the most useful possible major routes. The so-called slums, he never treated them as if they were uniform. He wanted to repair, if possible. Is this the... No, it isn't the one that's got it. He wanted repair, if possible, and only destroy if the homes were beyond repair. The gaps could then be used for gardens and trees, which would uplift the whole area, and many homes would still remain for the people. He saw his work as under B you get all the different kinds of houses in the slum. That's the pucka house, the thatched house, the houses in ruins, and then the vegetable gardens and the porch, etc. He saw his work as people-orientated. After getting an understanding of the city by walking it and mapping it, he spent his time meeting groups of interested citizens, listening to their hopes and problems, and going with them to see what could be done. But Geddes' planning commissions from municipalities dried up, as his ideas were not popular amongst the municipal officers. He was, however, able to move to planning towns and cities in the native states for Maharajas, intrigued by his anti-Western stance. If you look again at the list, you will see a green one. It's 1918, but the work he published in 1918, he did in 1917. 1917 marked a hiatus for Geddes as a consequence of personal tragedy. Both Geddes' wife, out in India to help her husband, and his eldest son, on active service during the First World War, died in 1917, and he was devastated. He flung himself into more work, a commission from the Maharaja of Indore, to deaden his grief. He also vowed to make his Indore report, which ran to 2 volumes, his most considered and fullest exposition of his Indian town planning work. It was to be a memorial to them both for the support they had given him in his voluntary work for civic and social reconstruction. Town planning was only a part of this. He saw himself as an urban sociologist. Town planning was an applied part of that remit, and that is why the Indore report is green. It was published in 2 volumes, as I said, and the second volume, of which you can see the rather crumpled copy, contained a detailed proposal for social reconstruction projects, most importantly for a University of Central India. After that, there are the 3 dark blue reports. Geddes tried his best in sometimes hostile territory. He valiantly tried to make a plan for the very congested business district in Calcutta, Bara Bazar. But his techniques seemed less appropriate within such a large city beset with many urban problems. His last 2 reports more or less followed the patterns of the earlier work, with the same reiterations of his solutions to the identified Indian urban problems of the time. That's my whistle-stop talk relating exactly to the reports. I now want to talk more about Geddes as the town planner and his approach. What is unique and unusual about Geddes' Indian reports was in fact their impact as town planning reports at the time was very modest, while subsequently the fact they existed and that they contained Geddes' ideas on planning and his special approach has kept them in the repository of work of pioneers, while at the same time few have had much detailed knowledge of them. It may be initially that the Indian reports gained a mythical status, since few people were able to read them. The complete set, the first and only complete, well, not the only one, there was another one later, but in the interwar period, the complete set was to be found in the library of the Calcutta Improvement Trust in India. And Liverpool architecture graduates, schooled by Patrick Abercrombie in planning methods and Geddes' planning mantra, survey, diagnosis and plan, beat a path to Calcutta to read them. It was almost as if Geddes' Indian reports were seen as the holy grail of modern planning at the time, though I do wonder what the students made of them when they read them. But it was not all a romantic myth. The reports provide a unique insight into an alternative approach to city development. They were not based on techniques of urban design or engineering, though of course Geddes worked alongside engineers and architects. Their significance was based on demonstrating how a planner may respond to the people she was planning for in a practical, ad hoc way, but with an approach that was dependent on an understanding of history, geography, politics, and an understanding of particular places. In other words, an interdisciplinary approach to the modern world. The central objective for the planner, or for the social reconstructionist, was to find, by every conceivable method, intellectual and human, practical and pragmatic, the possible indications of evolutionary activity towards a better future. Geddes had been working on this all his life, so in that sense, the Indian reports were a culmination of the practical activities he had engaged in his exploration of evolution, the equation he was fond of quoting as EFO equals OFE. Of course, in the 1920s and 30s, organised economic and social planning for the future had become a reality in the extreme political circumstances of, on the one hand, the survival of the communist state in Russia and the fascist states in Italy and Germany, and on the other, the environmental crisis in the USA that produced the Tennessee Valley Authority to control development, preserve the environment, and sustain the livelihoods of the people. In Holland, the urban planning genius Joel Meyer de Caceres developed the subject planology by the end of the 1920s, an interdisciplinary approach to urban and environmental planning, which is going to come out in my series in July, if you have never heard of it before. But it did not get accepted in every school of planning in Holland until the 1960s. Now historians are finding new interest in Geddes' ideas on social reconstruction and the practical examples of his Indian reports. A very recent study published last year on Geddes and Victor Bramford, his leading co-worker in sociological studies, by John Scott and Ray Bromley, has been devoted to their sociological ideas. Scott and Bromley suggest that Geddes' view of sociology was a grand and ambitious one that made sociology the crown of the social sciences in the Spencerian mode. The one on the right is a series that Geddes and Bramford produced in the First World War while he was doing the Indian reports, called The Making of the Future. And you can see on the left the volumes they thought they were going to bring out. Not all of those appeared, but ideas, well, anyway, it gives you an idea. But I want to pursue this thing of the Spencerian mode. But was actually what Geddes was trying to do was based on an understanding of both the theory of evolution and history. And these diagrams were shown in his cities and town planning exhibition. And they relate to the evolution of the modern world. And what he'd managed by these rather strange diagrams, we find them strange, I suppose, but they were very readable for his generation. That they were a good starting point for looking for fresh ways of achieving a different future. This is what Bromley and Scott are arguing. The mission of social reconstruction was to show people what choices they may have. For the sociologists, the first requirement was to provide, as far as possible, a scientific understanding of society to make sure that the choices were realistic. E-utopia, not utopia. And this is what Geddes worked on with Victor Bramford. I'm going to leave this slide for you. The only reason I put up the American Journal of Sociology is this terrible last paragraph, but at least it gives you some idea of what they were trying to do. Anyway, this was the insight. Can you read it as well as when I talk? Perhaps you can. You don't need to read it very carefully. This was the insight that Geddes brought to India, alongside his efforts to improve the technical proficiencies of those with a duty to deal with the problems of Indian cities. He wanted to awaken the Indian people themselves to the choices they could make for their own future. He, of course, went to India, he was in India in 1919, and he could hardly avoid understanding that this was a critical moment for the British in India. And actually, at that very moment, he resigned from his chair in Dundee and took up an offer for a similar part-time chair at the University of Bombay. And he called this the Chair of Sociology and Civics. And he believed that this was a much-needed thing for India. And he also believed that the study of social reconstruction itself required a global reach and needed to be supported by world universities and world cities. And he saw Bombay as a world city of the future. However, Geddes did not have much success in influencing the future of sociology in India, in Britain, or elsewhere during the interwar years. And everybody forgot about the Indian reports. But they made a sensational comeback in Britain in the context of the Second World War, when there was a huge interest in civic reconstruction, especially after the Blitz. The instrument for reviving interest in Geddes was this little book, Patrick Geddes in India, edited by Jacqueline Tirrett and published in 1947. The extraordinary role that Tirrett, this is the lady talking to Nehru, took, the extraordinary influence that she played is a complicated one to unravel. But there is now, fortunately, an excellent new biography of Tirrett by Ellen Shoshka. Her career was astonishing. She was born into an upper-class family where marriage is what daughters did. But she moved from being she didn't do that. She trained as a landscape gardener and had a modest career in that. But then she became one of the most well-connected of participants in the modern movement in architecture by being the woman who helps the chaps, which is why nobody knows about her until Shoshka's book. And she became a trusted planning advisor to the UN, a professor of urban design at Harvard, and later an expert on Japanese planning. Her volume brought Geddes and the Indian reports to a far wider audience than ever before. But unfortunately, this little volume also marked the definitive moment when town planners and sociologists, at least in Britain, parted company. This may have been inevitable because in Britain, sociology had been nurtured in the London School of Economics, and there had been under the tradition of that's set up by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, which was at the opposite pole, of course, to Patrick Geddes and Bramford's ideas. And the sociologists in the immediate post-World War II period wanted to rebel a bit against the administrative idea of sociology. But they didn't then turn to Geddes when they were seeking a new identity. They just simply dropped Geddes as irrelevant. And then, as they were dropping Geddes as irrelevant, the planners actually clung on to Geddes because the raison d'etre of post-war planning was to raise the physical conditions of modern life for all. And Geddes seemed to be a unique source on the critical subject of the interaction between urban design and meeting the needs of the people. This is what attracted a number of architect planners to study his ideas. One such was Percy Johnson Marshall, who later became Professor of Architecture and Planning at Edinburgh in the late 1960s. He had spent periods during the war posted in India, which helped him to be especially receptive to Geddes's approach. Tirrett was a brilliant propagandist, and she saw the opportunity for her little volume on the Indian reports. But she believed that to make the book influential, Geddes's words needed heavy editing. I give you this editor's note. She was a very fierce editor, and she took some extracts, any extract that she could find that vaguely said what she wanted it to say, savagely cutting the rest, and then she rewrote them. So she not only blurred the distinction between the reports, she changed the language, she changed the ideology almost. And I want to illustrate the last point with just, I'm sorry about all these words on, but you've seen this one before. I'm going to focus, she put two principles of planning, that was the whole business of civic reconstruction with just two principles. And the first one she took from the Madras report. And it was exactly that passage that I asked you to read earlier. And I'm going to show you, just to remind you, because you've probably forgotten already, that's the one. You don't have to read it again, but it just reminds you that that was the passage, as Geddes said it, at the end of his exciting time back in 1914, when he really wanted to do great things in India. This is what Jacqueline Tyrwhitt wrote. Upper class landscape gardener. Then she added her coup de grace. These were beautiful black and white photos. She had discovered through her social contacts that the brilliant photographer Anthony Denny had been posted to India during his war service and taken some photographs, and through her contacts she managed to get hold of them. And the result was stunning. If you remember me talking about the little roads that needed to be protected by the main road, this she put as a picture of a little road. They are so beautiful. I used to pore over them before I actually went there. This is actually in Madura. If you remember, in Madura, Geddes had drawn that little square with a tree in it. Well, she found a photograph. These photographs are not taken for the book. These had just been photographs taken by Denny because he was a brilliant photographer. And she found it, so, wow, we can use this. And there's the tree, and the little boy, and the God by the door. And, oh, God, isn't it lovely? Tanks. Well, that isn't a tank, that is a river. But washing and how, black and white photography at its best, actually. Here they're washing it, that is a tank. What Tyrwhitt achieved was a text and an image to fit the agenda of Reconstruction propaganda and to stimulate an emotional response to a planning ideal. She herself moved on to supporting the modern movement, joining the Mars Group in London and the CIAM in the 50s. Geddes, for her, resurfaced in her village community work for the UN, the context in which she met Nehru. As the sociologists and planners parted company, so interest in Geddes's reports fell into abeyance after this sort of burst of interest for half a century. Then an Italian urbanist and city planner, Giovanni Ferraro, became seriously interested and wrote a book, this book, in 1998. The Italian title means The Rehabilitation of Hope. His treatment of the reports, and he had actually read at least 6 of the volumes, is sensitive to Geddes's ideas on evolution, on life, and on planning. He pays attention to what Geddes suggests about the importance of the moral and the spiritual, the secular and the educational aspects of city culture, and suggests that Geddes understood their importance in a healthy body politic. Rehabilitation of the past to serve the future was the gift that Geddes gave to India, showing them the value of their own Indians, the value of their own culture, history, arts and sciences, architecture and built environment, and their close understanding of the natural world. In sum, Geddes showed respect for the Indian contribution to the knowledge of human life at every level. This approach has been taken up in a broader study by the German architect and urban planner Volker Welter in his book Biopolis of 2002. in which he presents material from the Indian reports within his overall analysis of Geddes' planning ideas. He too emphasises the revolt against a purely rational approach to understanding the city and the significance of culture in shaping life. City life, I mean. But amongst the new work, there is one strong dissenting voice, and that's of Noah Rubin, geographer and town planner. She joins a number of other geographers and planners who, at moments over the last 30 years, Michael Hebbett springs to mind as the geographer planner who has also put the knife in Geddes' ideas on regions, who have felt that Geddes' promises have misled more than they enlightened. Having scoured the historiography on Geddes, and you will find there a fairly comprehensive bibliography of current work, she wrote, "She could not work out a word of Geddes' theory of town planning. I still don't know how Geddes planned. I could not bridge the gap between Geddes' general theories and the selective account of his planning tools, as in spite of the long-lasting and contentious discussion of Geddes as a town planner, the historiography of his work lacks a basic attempt to trace his overall planning system. What was Geddes' much-praised planning paradigm?" Well, you might think she has only read Tirrett's volume Geddes in India, but I know for a fact that she has at least seen the outside covers of all the Indian reports, as when she visited me en route she visited me in Nottingham en route for the National Archives in Edinburgh. I actually entrusted my entire collection to her to be transported there, as I thought that was the safest repository for the future, so that anybody who's interested in the world can find them at least in total in Edinburgh. Anyway, perhaps Noah is looking for something that wasn't there. Geddes was a 19th century philanthropist. His practical planning activities resemble most the similar kind of work pioneered by Octavia Hill in London in the 1860s. Geddes, as a young man, had visited Hill's houses in Marylebone and had seen at first hand how she started with the people, helped them improve their homes, and fought for them to have some contact with nature, greenery around their homes, small parks close by, larger green open spaces to visit. She was supported by volunteer workers who cared. She helped, of course, with Hampstead Heath and many others. She was supported by volunteer workers who cared, and she, while keeping their volunteer status, helped them to become professionals in their work. She hoped her work would spread to other towns and cities on this basis, and she was against gaining help from the state. Geddes worked exactly the same way with his volunteers, but his visions extended further than hers. In his Edinburgh survey work, he encompassed the whole city and its region, and its past and its present. He had founded, and people forget this, the Regional Survey Association for Volunteers in 1913, the year that he was also a founding member of the Town Planning Institute. Yet it was the techniques of regional survey that he took into his planning work, rather than the desire to promote professional planning with state support, as espoused by the Town Planning Institute. Surveys were to be carried out by volunteers, wherever they were to be found, informed by his guidance. His cities and town planning exhibition that he took to India was the basic material for encouraging this work and indicating how one undertook it. And he just believed something that we probably are only recognising much more now, that it is only the commitment of engaged people on a voluntary basis that helps to sustain the physical and social environment of cities. But it doesn't mean that his ideas, his planning ideas, were a mere 19th century piece of philanthropy. Geddes made serious contributions on how to select buildings important to a city's identity, on how to set about heritage and conservation work, as well as some clear guidelines on preparing plans for city expansion and new suburbs. But his practical work has to be seen within his intellectual effort to understand the impact of modernity on cities and people, and the possibility of using scientific knowledge to avoid the worst consequences of what had happened in the past. The ambition was huge. India gave him a chance to demonstrate what he meant. In India, just a tiny number of urban historians understand and appreciate his work. Narayani Gupta, whose father was the last director of the Calcutta Improvement Trust, and whom I met in 1972 when I was looking for all the reports supposedly in the Calcutta Improvement Trust, and none were any longer there. Anyway, she has always been grateful for the way Geddes admired Indian cities and their traditions and tried to help Indians themselves to see what they had. She often compares him to the architectural historian and Scotsman James Fergusson, whose influential 3-volume History of World Architecture, published between 1865 and 7, praised Indian architecture at a time when it was denigrated and made claims that it was the most beautiful and sophisticated in the world. Geddes did that for Indian cities, as is recognised in the excellent new study of Calcutta 1800 to 1940 by Partho Datta. Geddes features in this too as an inspiration for a better future, even though his work in Calcutta on the Bara Bazar report of 1919 was completely disregarded. Last year, in a totally different context, a brilliant collection of papers in America was published called Planning Ideas That Matter, that was put together by professors from MIT and Princeton and all this kind of thing, was put together to clarify the forces that have shaped urban and regional planning over the last century, looking at developed and underdeveloped countries. The editors came up with 4 concepts: livability, territoriality, governance, and reflective practice. Geddes's work has something to contribute to all of these. The Indian reports give ample historical evidence of this. Thank you.